Hello, and welcome to our discussion with General James Cartwright and Lieutenant Colonel Chris Mulder from the Atlantic Council on their report, The Future of Security in Space, a 30-Year U.S. Strategy. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association. I'm co-hosted by Lieutenant General retired Dave Buck, vice president of the Space Force Association. General Cartwright served for 40 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. General Cartwright's experience included being the commander, U.S. Strategic Command, before being nominated and appointed as the 8th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's second highest military officer. Lieutenant General Dave Buck served for 40 years in the U.S. Air Force. In General Buck's final assignment, he was dual-hatted as the commander of 14th Air Force, where he organized, trained, and equipped Space Forces and was the commander of Joint Functional Component Command for Space, where he directed operations for all assigned U.S. STRATCOM Space Forces. Lieutenant Colonel Chris Mulder is a career Air Force pilot. He worked air and space requirements on the Joint Staff, commanded an Operations Support Squadron, and is completing his fellowship year at the Atlantic Council. He reports to OSD this summer, and he is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. And ironically, today is a commencement where 116 cadets will become guardians in the U.S. Space Force. You can watch that live after this event. Thank you all for being here. Before we get started and allow you to provide opening comments, I'd just like to say the importance of this study right now. This study adds great importance to the Space Force because the current global economy relies on space resources, and the future, with radical abundance and critical need for resilience, is in space. Only the Space Force can best organize, train, and equip forces to defend national and international assets in that domain. The report highlights that space prioritizes the security and economic activities that occur within space itself, not just those they enable on Earth. Again, thank you for being here. General Cartwright, could you provide some opening comments, please, sir?
I'd be glad to. This study is a passion of mine from the standpoint of space and its importance, and has been for a lot of years for me. Oftentimes when we look at this and when we've done the introductory remarks with it, one of the first questions is, so why and what's changed? And I think it's important to look back. It's not like the space activities have been, just sitting on their hands for the last 10 years. Yes, we haven't gone back to the moon, but the activities in space have grown asymmetrically, and I think that's important to recognize. I think first in the what's changed activity bucket, during my time, certainly in the service, one of the things that we recognized were the vulnerabilities of our space activities, and with so much reliance on those activities, that was going to be a problem for us. That was number one. And number two was that the cost of going to space was keeping the sortie rate down dramatically. I mean, my first year as a STRATCOM commander, we had 4 launches. SpaceX has exceeded that in the first month of the year. So I think, we basically were looking at a strategy that encouraged, from an R&D perspective, disaggregation to increase resilience and to increase responsiveness for the support forces and the forces we supported. And that has taken hold, is moving out quite smartly. And then finding venues by which we could reduce the cost of escaping Earth's gravity well, getting to space, operating there, and then returning. And reuse has really emerged as one of the key activities that has dramatically changed the monetary requirements for doing operations in space, and has also changed the equation for our resilience and our ability to repopulate and our ability to respond to unanticipated. And so I think those are 2 real positive things that have fundamentally changed, have taken place, are now both in the national security construct and in the commercial construct. And I think that's really important to understand. With those changes comes what has been called congestion and competition. And yes, it's getting a lot busier and a lot more crowded in space. That's a good thing and that's a bad thing. And we take the good with the bad. But the fundamental shift in the risk-benefit equation monetarily for commerce is dramatic. What we can do now in space, mostly associated with data data analytics, transmission of data, transmission of entertainment venues, et cetera, comms. All of those things now have broad commercial acceptance, almost demand, and are ever growing. And I think that that's a fundamental shift that now says that the monetary value in space is growing dramatically. And so that's another fundamental shift. I think the third fundamental shift that we have seen is to go beyond GEO and LEO and to start to operate in areas in this campaign to return to the moon, but to start to understand cislunar space, its contribution to the GEO and the LEO belts and to the Earth. And all of those pieces are now starting to emerge. They're emerging in documents from a government standpoint and an industry standpoint about the value of what we're going to be able to do at those places. And then I think the last one, which really is focused, I think, primarily on where we would like to talk today about Space Force, is this idea of getting out of a regional construct and into a global construct that does not find itself malpositioned every time somebody wants to take action against us. Oh, wait a minute, we got to wait for the carriers to close. Oh, wait a minute, we got to wait for the bombers to close. Oh, wait a minute, we got to wait for. Space and what we can do with the Space Force and the infrastructure that this study points towards is to build out the ability to have a global perspective, to really be omnipresent at the millisecond level, to take action, to influence action, to prevent, ideally, or dissuade before something goes bad. And I think that value and what Space Force will bring with that global perspective is just tremendously powerful. And so I'll stop there. The idea of this study, though, is not to supplant the national security strategy. It is to pick up where that ends and to start to look out to the 30-year, in this particular study, the 30-year venue, to understand strategic objectives, to try to get continuity between the administrative branch of government and the legislative branch of government, to understand where it is we'd like to go. Yes, we're going to change our mind, but at least we have an understanding that would at least also contribute to the commerce side of the equation as to where we want to go, where we think the value will be, and what we need to protect in our interests in space and beyond GEO.
Thank you, General.
Thank you.
I'm sure your comments are going to resonate with Lieutenant General Buck. Sir, can you provide some opening comments as well?
Hey, thanks, Hip. I appreciate it. Great to be here. I want to say thanks to General Cartwright. Sir, thanks for carving out time. Great to see you again. And really looking forward to this forum. Same with Colonel Mulder. Thank you. We don't take this lightly. We'll respect your time. This is really a timely subject because, as we all know, space is critical not only to our national security, but also to our economic viability. I often say this, and I believe it. I think that space and the Space Force and U.S. Spacecom, not only are they COVID-proof because there are going to be bill payers associated with the pandemic, but it also has bipartisan support. And I'm really encouraged by that. What we have to focus on, I believe, is we can't get everything done at once. Space is a massive domain. How do we normalize operations in this domain, especially in an area of flatlined defense budgets, right? How do we prioritize what we need to get done in this domain? And I'm talking about things like what's the first thing? Is it policy? Is it domain awareness? Is it having actionable data, command and control? Is it having good cops and GUIs? Is it logistics? How we augment our with commercial and Five Eye partners? How we leverage artificial intelligence, machine learning, digital engineering, the effort to declassify what we're doing in space so we can talk about it. the rotation between a supported and supported command. Space is no longer just a supporting command. We're also now a supported command. How we disseminate, how we educate people, really. I'll tell you, when I was on active duty, I think I did a poor job educating the public about space. Space is a complicated domain to work in. And, we talk about things like orbital mechanics, people have a tendency to roll their eyes. You can't see a satellite streaking across the sky. It's not very visible. You can see an F-35, but the most visible part of space is space launch. And then that's it. Trust me, we have all these satellites up there. People don't want to hear it. We need to do a better job educating people as well. And once we educate people, I think we'll get them on board. We're doing a better job. I did a poor job of that. But I'm looking forward to this session, Bill, and thanks for setting this up.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. Somebody I'm sure who could relate to understanding space a little bit better and being educated on space is Lieutenant Colonel Chris Mulder. Sir, thanks so much for being with us today. And if you could just provide a few opening remarks.
Well, thanks, sir, for having me. My satellite uplink and downlink was affected this morning. So, like General Buck, I listened to a podcast with you and General Buck the other day, and space is a warfighting domain. That's a very, very significant change that has occurred, in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, ever since the Chinese took out their weather satellite in 2007 that has now caused a lot of debris, in the space domain, specifically in LEO. To General Buck's point about education, I think there's a lot of things that can educate the American public. I think that's a critical component here as we look to the future and seize, a vision for our nation and for the world. I have some ideas that might be somewhat or challenge the status quo that we can discuss. But I'm just blessed, to be in this opportunity. I'm an Air Force guy, just joined the Atlantic Council for my fellowship, stepped into this project, and we've taken, the spirit of General Scowcroft, who passed away, unfortunately, really when I showed up to the Atlantic Council, and his foresight, he was a visionary guy, interagency, pulling all the organizations together to benefit our nation. And then we took National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, his strategy construct, and so that's the paper, the baseline that the vision is based off of. And then Secretary James and General Cartwright that provided the true strategic vision, for the paper. It was a team effort. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my co-authors, Clementine Starling, Mark Massa, and Julia Siegel, including the rest of the team that pulled this together. We talked to multiple different people, inside government, outside government, and it was a very robust project, and I'm happy to be part of it. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate those comments. There's a lot to basically uncover in this document today. So, General Buck, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just start with kind of a broad question, and we can all chip in and answer it, whoever feels like they have a little piece part here. But so, I'm very much focused on warfighting and organized training and equipping, but let me just tee it up for General Cartwright real quick. Sir, from an organized, train, and equip perspective, how can the United States Space Force, and by the United States Space Force, I mean them providing, of course, forces to U.S. Spacecom, how can they prepare for the strategy that you outlined in your report?
My sense is they're probably already ahead of where the report went. They're not shrinking violets by any stretch of the imagination. They've got a great perspective on where the potentials lie. Certainly at the technical level, far better than mine. But I think this idea of a global infrastructure that both augments and in some cases supplants regional postures and regional basing constructs, things like that, starts to change how you think of presence, how you think of availability constructs, responsiveness. We are seeing the beginning through John Hyten of even the construct of operational fires. The idea that you could close those loops, that the latency of the data movement is so low that you can think about actually having strategic global fires capabilities to augment what you're doing on the ground and in the air, et cetera, or to integrate with them. That's kind of number one. Number two is that with the low latency data, with the ability to see globally pretty much constantly, your awareness fundamentally shifts. How you can prepare, the decision time is increased for strategic leaders, whether they be political or military. And that's something we're always looking for, is better decision opportunities, decision time, more quality information to inform those decisions. The architectures are starting to point towards the ability to do that. And that's fundamentally different than a regional construct, which in a kind of a Napoleonic structure starts at the bottom and we all tell each other up the chain what we think. And by the time it gets to the top, it's something completely different than what we started with. And so, changing that paradigm is going to be disruptive. But I think the Space Force is incredibly well positioned to work through that disruption with quality and value, which is fundamentally different than what you can do by just saying, gee, I want to do this differently. I don't like, levels of command and all of that stuff. This is a fundamental shift. Space Force is in a position to do things on a global scale, on timelines that heretofore meant proximity, physical proximity. And that's not going to be the same in the future. I think that's something they've got to do. I mean, my sense here is that the Guardians are globally present, period. That's their ethos. They are globally present. And that's a fundamental shift. It's one thing to say I'm a B-52 driver and I can get globally, just give me 24 hours. And another thing to say, just give me 24 milliseconds. It's a shift.
Right. I think you're exactly right. I think with General Hyten leading the charge and driving the jointness into everything we do is really critical in that regard. It's everything from joint all domain command and control to the new statement where he's going to have joint requirements. I just saw an article that said he's driving that pretty hard. So, sir, thank you for your perspective. Colonel Mulder, anything on that?
Yeah, I would just reiterate what General Cartwright said. It is a unique time in our history. In the grand scheme of things, how we're utilizing space is really in its infancy. Humans have always used space in some capacity, astronomy, and it really ties back to PNT, position, navigation, and timing. And now how we're harnessing the actual domain obviously has evolved. The Space Force is in a really exciting, time. It's like being a lieutenant where they should be super aggressive about, moving out and harnessing opportunities. I'm excited, for them as an Air Force officer. I think a strong space enterprise, including a strong Space Force, is beneficial to the nation, and it's also beneficial to the Air Branch. So there's a lot of positive linkages that will come from the Space Force and Space Command and the entire space enterprise as it continues to mature.
I often argue that when I was on active duty, one of the most important things that we could do, just from a Department of Defense perspective and from a space perspective, that we need dedicated intel professionals in space because intelligence drives operations. And we're finally there. Now we're going to have indigenous space professionals for space. We won't borrow them from the Air Force for 4 years and then give them back to the Air Force. To me, that was a fundamental thing. There are other fundamental steps we can take as well. I think fundamentally we need to have domain awareness all the time. And without domain awareness, what's going on in space, we used to call it SSA, now it's SDA, but without that fundamental awareness, we can't really have domain superiority. And then we have to have actionable data. And once you have actionable data, you need to be able to command and control the force. It goes on, right? And where do you start? Where are the priorities? And then you need to involve the Five Eye partners and our commercial partners, because we can't afford to do this alone. And frankly, commercial is moving a lot faster than we are. So, I mean, there's all these things. So my follow-on question to that would be, General Cartwright, how do you prioritize this? How do you cut this elephant up? And where do you see we should get our best bang for the buck, say in the next 5 to 10 years?
You know, my sense in the next 5 to 10 years is that we're going to start to build out the infrastructure and then scale that infrastructure up. That infrastructure being the sensing infrastructure, the communications infrastructure, the P&T infrastructure, et cetera. All of those things are going to require to be scaled. Not only scaled in the GEO and LEO and Earth side of the equation, but on out to cislunar. And all of those contracts and activities are already started. It's a question of continuity, as we talked about earlier, continuity of resource and intent, and continuing to move forward. You know, the good and the bad of competition is that the bad is that maybe I could study this a little longer and do something different, versus, okay, I got to get something up there now, and I'll learn by putting something up there now and building the infrastructure out. It's interesting to me when you look at the commercial side of this and the international side of it. I've worked with different countries, and I've worked with different states in the United States, you know, who are raising their hand and going, what's in this for me? What can I do? How is it going to work for me? And the reality is, if you look, as was said earlier, at what you can see about space, and you look at the launch, okay, and people are going, gee, maybe they should be launching from my state. Well, I reviewed a study from a state in the United States, and their conclusion was that the likelihood of employment and the likelihood of revenue flow for a spaceport in their state would not outperform a single fast food store. Okay. Launch is probably right now not where the money is, but data and analytics and commerce and communications, infrastructure type activities are where it is. And it's going to be the same for the military. And so building out those comm channels, building out the resilience of those architectures, building out the sensing such that it is, in fact, with onboard ML and AL activities, at least in the narrow side of the equation, gives us a unified view, not a deconflicted view, not a sequenced view, but a unified view of what's happening in the world and what's happening in space. And I think that's where we've got to go. That's the critical pieces right now. The reach pieces are out at cislunar. And people will say, why cislunar? You know, I got enough problems with just the GEO and the LEO belt. Well, okay. The Marine in me says, okay, yeah, I'm not going to build a house on that mountain, but I'd sure like to be able to stand up there and look down and see what's going on. And the strategic high ground right now is going to be cislunar, and the strategic choke points for space are in cislunar at the Lagrange points. And if we don't understand what's happening there, we're not watching the main highways. And I think that's going to be the stretch goal. That's the stretch goal. That's not this year, although there are decisions being made, quite frankly, right now by Space Force about the architecture of that activity and how it's going to look, and test programs to validate it. So I'm really heartened by the forward-looking ideas that are coming out of the Space Force. they really do show a progressive approach, the lieutenant's approach to this. and I just really like that. I hope that we don't squash it. Okay, I hope we don't kill it. But boy, I think you've got the opportunity right now to go. But it's the infrastructure side of this thing. The resilience of that infrastructure that we could then lay back on and scale into is going to be the critical part for the next 5 years.
Thank you, General Cartwright. A follow-on question is for Lieutenant Colonel Mulder. Sir, how important is it to look at the emerging threats and then go through a very deliberate onboarding process through testing, tactics, and training, not only for capabilities, but for expertise development? Can you talk a little bit about your own experience, in the Air Force? Learning to become an expert in the F-16 took quite a bit of time. Can you talk a little bit about the infrastructure necessary for you to accomplish that task?
Sure, that's a great question, and I could go into detail on it. It's really a crawl, walk, run approach, not only at the individual level, where I went to pilot training, then I was a first-time instructor pilot, so I honed my flying skills, and then I went to F-16 training, and then had multiple follow-on assignments there, and every stage contributed to my development. And so I had a responsibility as an individual to really dive into the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures. And then the infrastructure, there was a responsibility on the infrastructure side, specifically in the Air Force, to provide me resources, the time, experienced instructors that could help me get up to speed. And then, our nation and Congress, they have a responsibility to provide the tools and resources as well to the Air Force. And I think the same construct applies to the space professionals as they go through their training. And it can start really in elementary, middle, and high school. That's as early as it could start. And then the Space Force onboards space professionals, and same mentality, crawl, walk, run. Everybody, is in it, for the nation to advance our interests. And so just briefly, that's a little bit of my experience.
Yeah, I would just 2 cents more here. I would add that, and this is probably not along the main line here, but the bulk of space is going to be AI. Okay, it's not going to be somebody riding a vehicle around. As much as Star Wars makes that look attractive, the reality is over 99% of the vehicles in space right now are not manned. Okay, and so it's going to be a fundamentally different approach as to what it is that the human brings to the equation. And there is a lot that it can, particularly on edge cases and on assessment. And then what is it the machine can do, and how the machine grows in the ability that it can do. That's going to be interesting here. And it's going to be a different kind of set of priorities. I mean, right now, the duty Marine, you're a Marine and you equip the Marine. That's probably not what it's going to look like for the Space Force. And we're in the infancy, so we don't know exactly. And I don't want to pour any cement too quickly, because that will do for space what was the struggle for the Predator and the Reaper. No, I'm not going to let it land by itself. I want a person to land it. I'm not going to let it fire by itself because I want a person. Yeah, all of these things, not technically challenging, but politically and culturally challenging. And in space, you don't have the option. You're not going to have a person in every vehicle up there ever that I can see, particularly in the early stages. And so it is going to be a fundamentally different approach to how we do it. And the education part of that is going to have to reflect that difference. And I'm on board with what Chris is saying is, there's a crawl, walk, run activity here, but it's going to be a little bit different than what we have used in the past in bringing weapons to bear. We have been in a crew per platform construct forever. And now we're going to go to a platforms per crew construct. And it's a fundamental shift. It's a fundamental shift. And we can watch it play out in the Air Force right now with pilots and drones and things like that, or you pick your service. They all have varying activities. But in space, it's there from the start. And so how we do this is going to be very interesting. The education side of this, my sense is, one, in a 30-year career, going to school for 3 times for 9 months each is not going to hack it. You know, school and education is going to have to be constant, and it's going to have to be built into your everyday life, because it's not going to work to just say I graduated from. That's just not going to hack it. It's too dynamic an environment, too easy to change it. I'll stop. I'm sorry, my soapbox.
Good, Hippie. Let me add my 1 cent then. So this goes to building a culture of combat readiness and warfighters and where we're going. We have to, when I was growing up in the business, we were a service provider, and we are no longer a service provider. But it's more than that. We have to change our rules of engagements, and our authorities right now are archaic. And we have to foundationally understand. General Cartwright, when you were STRATCOM commander, you had to go to the Secretary of Defense to do certain things in space, which in the Air Force, a captain would have the authority to do. We need to, and we can't go there in this forum, obviously, but I think you know what I'm referring to, sir. We've got to fundamentally update those authorities and delegate those authorities down to people who are executing the mission in space. There are so many things we have to do, and it's almost overwhelming, but we have to, and it frustrated me when I was out of Annenberg and I had to go through the STRATCOM commander who had to go to the Secretary of Defense for things that I thought that my colonel on the ops floor should have the ability to do. So there's a lot here to stitch this all together to protect and defend this domain.
Thank you, General Buck. And this gets back to that point that obviously General Cartwright was making and Chris was making about continuing to evolve and become an expert in the domain, and then being able to provide a feedback mechanism to ensure that you've got the best capabilities to support domain superiority, you know, and support multi-domain superiority, because you can't have multi-domain superiority without individual domain superiority. So let's talk just for a moment about the acquisition process and the importance of the feedback loop from the frontline operator back to the acquisition process to ensure we have the most relevant technology to support that domain superiority. We can talk about it in terms of reference from the other services, General Cartwright and Lieutenant Colonel Mulder, and even General Buxer, or we can talk about it just in terms of your own personal perspective. So I'll turn it over to the panel for that discussion. General Cartwright?
I think one thing that culture that you have to acknowledge up front, particularly in standing up a new force like this, whether it was cyber or whatever domain type activity you built. The first is the machinations that we have gone through to have a Space Force and an Air Force. Okay, and the construct to have a common secretary. I think one of the key issues for the new Secretary of the Air Force is to, one, strap on the responsibility of integrating the domains, making that transition from one to the other and the integration of one to the other. Integration, not sequencing, not deconflicting, but to actually integrate them and to hold the secretary kind of like the Secretary of the Navy accountable for that stitching together and making sure that the radio in space is going to be able to talk to the radio in the airplane, and all of the simple things that we screw up on a regular basis. So that's kind of part one. Part two is the idea of multi-domain activities right now is a sequencing deconfliction activity. Space has a fundamental opportunity to completely change that paradigm, whether it be through the command and control side of the equation, the comm side of the equation, the provisioning and movement of capability and fires to wherever they're needed on the face of the earth. Those constructs will start to fundamentally shift what is today accepted as doctrine in the other domains. Cyber will help us, quite frankly. To do that, to think like that. And the reason I say that is that today, if I'm an Army or a Marine general, or you pick it, I go by, I define mass as the number of people I have, my ability to move those people around, etc. Mass is not just a physical property anymore. If you can, through space, and take cyber as an example, defend, deter, detect, whatever it is you want to do, any place on the face of the earth to billions of targets at once. That's mass. Okay. And right now we're not treating it as mass. We don't treat it as mass. It's something else. Okay. We'll call those guys and we'll ask them to do something and we'll tell them what time they're supposed to stop. But, that's not the way to build this activity. And so there's some fundamental shifts here that have to occur in joint warfighting, which we're going to have places that we can go, sandboxes we can play in to really understand this activity. I think the red flag activities have tried to do this and are trying, and that's a key venue to do it. But allies are going to be equally important here. We can't do this alone, number one. And number two, we can't say, yeah, come along. I can't tell you what I'm going to do, but come along with me because it's all a secret. That's just not going to work for us. It just will not work. And we've got to find a way to move beyond this. I really like the initiatives that have occurred. I just spent a good amount of time with the French Space Force and including them in, and bringing them in at a level of the, of key allies like Japan, et cetera, that are not part of Five Eyes, and giving them access in ways that we have not been able to do before is really starting to, one, change the trust factor, two, the willingness to partner factor, et cetera. And so if we're going to build good, cohesive alliances, which we have to do, this is part of that activity that's going to have to go on the education and the doctrine side. And underplaying those will be at our peril.
Thank you, General Cartwright. I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Mulder for his perspective from the tactical perspective. How important is it to provide that feedback loop through the testing, tactics, training process back to the acquisition to ensure you've got the capabilities necessary to execute your mission?
Yeah, it's vital. I worked requirements on the joint staff, and I know General Cartwright advanced the requirements process, and now, like you mentioned, General Hyten is modifying it as well. From a tactical perspective, though, it is extremely frustrating when you don't feel like you have a voice and an input. And so I think any incentive to pull and then push the feedback up the chain and down the chain is going to be very, very critical as we look to building out the infrastructure, that General Cartwright talked about. General Buck talked about, how do you prioritize? My internal response was yes, yes, yes. It's all important. And to do that, you're going to have every voice, which includes the tactical level voice, providing that input. So we need to, accelerate the OODA loop as we move forward.
Thank you, sir. And I'll defer to Lieutenant General Buck. Sir, you've lived this process and are currently living this process in your day today.
Right. So, so many things to talk about here, but I'll try to be succinct, right? I believe that a key tenet of this will be the National Space Test and Training Range. And we need our own range-like capability, our own Nellis-like capability in the Space Force. And I think we're going to get there. And it's not going to look like a Nellis range. It's going to be a space range. It's going to be largely well, as we play it out, is if you can think about a range where we can use this range to increase the TRLs before we actually field the weapon system, thereby reducing the time it takes to field the platform from 12 years now to maybe something more realistic around 5 years. And we can have confidence that we have a high TRL before we launch to orbit, and that. But not only a range for the acquisition piece, but a range for advanced training too, and recurring training, and our wargaming. And you can imagine the possibilities of a Nellis-like range in space. I think that's part and parcel to this acquisition process. And then we need, HIP, and I'm passionate about this, is to get a 561st JTS-like capability into STARCOM. We need our own ability, our own 3TAC1 manuals, and we need to put some real meat against those manuals and incorporate what we're learning in these war games into these 3-1 manuals. And then from those 3-1 manuals, we build the targeting folders and the weaponeering effects and all that good stuff that we like to talk about. So I'll pause there. I get passionate about this stuff.
Thank you, sir. And it looks like General Cartwright has some additional comments. Every Marine a rifleman, isn't that right, General Cartwright? So what is how do we compare that to the future in the Space Guardians?
Well, my sense is that the Guardians being global is where that's going to go. That mindset, that ethos is what's going to be critical for them to understand and have. So that I think is point one. My sense is that as we start to build out the space infrastructure, it is not going to be driven by platform timelines. In other words, today, if somebody outflanks me, then I'm going to go build a platform to solve that problem. And that 15-year cycle is not going to hack it. Okay. So it's more probably going to be that while we're going to continue to do, the exquisite manufacturing that we do, that to future-proof these weapons and to keep a competitive advantage through their life cycle, the software side of this, the firmware side of this activity, the feedback loops that are direct from the user, and the user can see something different by the next day, those are going to be the things that drive that activity. Will it be for every single thing? No. But will it be for the critical activities? I absolutely believe that that's going to be the case, and it's going to create a flexibility and a OODA loop, as Chris put it, that is inside of 24 hours. And probably well inside of that for a lot of capabilities. I mean, if I look today at, okay, I don't like how long it takes my Tesla to slow down. Okay, change it tonight, Elon, and tomorrow morning it's different. I mean, it's got to move in that direction. It's not that we're walking away from manufacturing. It's not that building platforms isn't hard. That's not the issue. But to really help in future-proofing these platforms, we've got to do something other than train the operator anew. We've actually got to make them be able to do things that they didn't envision when they were built. And that's going to come through the firmware and software part, and it's probably going to come directly out of the Space Force. In other words, I'm hoping that either through the lab side of the equation for the Space Force or actually indigenous into the force are the people who can change the fundamental functioning based on being flanked, based on operational need, you pick it, in a way that we just aren't thinking about right now, because we haven't thought about building it that way. And I think that's going to be critical. And you can start to see that in the new platforms. The number one addition in the new platforms is increased storage and increased processing power on orbit at the edge. And that's critical. And the chip architectures are now starting to bring in the AI and the ML type functions for very narrow activities, but still able to do that kind of processing power on orbit is going to give you flexibility on the ground that you never had.
I would add to that, HIP, and I'll real quickly here. It's one thing to have all this data but you've got to make the data actionable too. So there's a back end piece of that we need to work on in addition to the AI ML piece. We've got to make that data actionable to the commanders and the operators on the ground.
Thank you, General Cartwright and General Buck. Good words. I tell you, I've had the opportunity to sit down with Major General Kim Kreider, one of the architects for the Space Force as a digital service, and also Colonel Kralkowski, and the imperative need to ensure that folks are able to articulate in that environment and talk about the requirements in terms of data, in terms of processing, in terms of software development. And one of the discussion points we had is perhaps instead of building out a specific capability, we build out applications that can be used by decision makers very quickly and test those applications based on the data that's out there. Because to your point, I think everyone's making the same point, is the data is there, but how do we use the data? And how do we make folks digitally smart so that they can start executing and using that information? So I'll pause for comments on that.
My sense here is, one is that putting the processing power at the edge makes for a much cleaner activity because you're not integrating different data formats. You're on the platform. That makes it a lot quicker, and that's one advantage of moving this stuff towards the edge. But you're right, bringing it back and then seeing the bigger view and creating a view for the commander is a different one. And quite likely, I mean, this is just my own brain, but if you look at the hurricane season and you look at the spaghetti charts, I mean, I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see processing biased in different ways and applied, and then you get the spaghetti chart and you got a sense of where's their convergence, where are the edge cases, if I really want to be bold, would I go? Those kinds of things will happen in presentation. But building a data architecture is so fundamental to this that allows us to integrate this data, which fundamentally can't be the same. The waveforms have to be different for space and underwater and air and everything else. We're not going to get rid of that. But having an integrated way to approach that such that you can make all of this data coherent is somewhat of a holy grail right now, but there is an awful lot of technology that's going to it, conceptual-based computing and things like that looks like it's starting to solve this in a way that gives us some hope that we can do this. The key thing that we will do wrong, and we are doing wrong right now, is we only have 2 repositories of data, NRO's data and NSA's data, okay? After that, it's just kind of, what did I write down? What did I see? What did I feel? That's not going to happen. It's just not going to cut it, number one. And number two, the access to that data is so privileged and so guarded that it's not useful for the common airman, Marine, guardian. It's just not there. And we've got to find a way to fix that because data is at the root of solving a lot of these problems.
Sir, if I could hop in. The Chinese, well, step back 1 second. There are about 8 billion people in the world. 3 to 4 billion of those people don't have access to internet. The Chinese are building out a 10,000 broadband constellation, construct in LEO. So you can see where this is going. If they can tap into those 3 or 4 billion people and access data that those people can't necessarily generate right now, they can yield influence and power. And so I'll, just back up General Cartwright, that figuring out a way to process and to feed in our own data and also to tap into the data that I know the Chinese are seeking will be very, very important.
And General Buck, I don't know if you can talk about your support to advanced training activities that are going on and the importance of data in support of those advanced training activities. But if you want to provide a few comments on that, sir.
I better be careful on that front, Hip.
Okay, sir.
I don't want, yeah.
Okay, well, we do have a question. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Nope, go ahead.
I said, we do have a question from the audience. What is the panel's thoughts on the new U.S. Spacecom being formed as a geographic combat command rather than a functional one like U.S. Stratcom? Will that shift in focus to define physical domain degrade their relationship with other geographic COCOMs? General Cartwright.
I think that, like with Cyber Command, we didn't quite understand and haven't yet quite figured out where it belongs. I think that the construct that we have, the protocol that we have today, is that train and equip is done by domain. Okay, and then operational activities are done by geographic areas, and that is a relic of bygone years. We don't even fight that way anymore, but we still have these massive commands. There's nothing else for situation awareness, although they believe they're warfighters, and that'll stir people up. That's not the point. The point here is that the vocabulary is not doing us justice, and it's creating artificial barriers that probably don't belong there anymore. And so it worries me a little bit, because if you organize by domain, which that's okay, but if nobody's responsible for integrating the domains at the train and equip level, then you've got a problem. Okay, and that's not to say the service chiefs aren't trying, but the legislating and the money and the incentive structure is all by domain, and 1/3. And oh yeah, we'll give a few pennies to these guys over here for cyber, and we'll give you a few dimes for space. That's not going to work. We have to start to think about the problem differently. It may be that we continue to do train and equip by domain, but part of that train and equip in order to get your degree is that you've got to understand the transitions across those domains. I think the two classic examples that I use in public speaking, one is with the Army and the Marine Corps at the beginning of the first Iraq conflict. Okay, neither one of them had a radio that they could talk to the other guy. Okay, I had to go out in the requirements process and buy all new Army radios for the Marine Corps. Okay, and as soon as the conflict was over, the Marine Corps threw those radios away and went back to their old radios. So then we legislated that they must be able to talk, and they said, okay, we'll have one line that goes through at the division level, nothing below that. That's not understanding domain warfare. That's not understanding how you want to progress in this thing. And so we've got to figure this out. It's not that diversity isn't good, but diversity that gets in the way of a unified vision of where you're going is a problem for us. So I kind of feel that, yes, it's not well articulated as to what Space Force and Spacecom are and where they fit, and clearly the geographic boundary construct is no longer valid. And that's why I keep harping on Space Force being global. Forget the domains. You're global, and that won't be the word. I mean, somebody's got to come up with a name that, that's some real important person, and they'll, name it after their children. But we've got to come up with a vocabulary that changes the mindset. And I think Space Force is in exactly the right place to do that, because they're not thinking, that there are any boundaries here. They're not thinking that I can only talk over the Pacific, or I can't talk to the guy in the Atlantic. They're not thinking that way at all. And that's really refreshing to me.
Thank you, sir. And I know we do have limited amount of time, only about 5 minutes. So in closing comments, sir, General Buck, if you want to just provide your perspective on that question about the geographic versus functional.
Yeah, real quick. Space is very unique in that we not only provide effects to the theater at all times for every theater around the globe, and who adjudicates what theater gets what priority. So we are in the unique position of providing those effects to the theaters all the time. We're also in the unique position we have to protect and defend this massive AOR at the same time. So I agree with General Cartwright. We are in a unique position to help figure this out for the Department of Defense.
Great, thank you, sir. And Lieutenant Colonel Mulder, how important is it to receive feedback from those different geographic commands in support of U.S. Spacecom in terms of the threat environment?
I've never been a combatant commander before, so but it's important, obviously, to get information, down to the warfighter. Do you mind if I just say 30 seconds closing comments on something?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yes. So what I am in the business of is trying to inspire people in provoking thought. George Washington was a super believer in air balloons, hot air balloons, back in the late 1700s. President Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to take to the air. No world leader has ever been to space. I think if we really want to pull the American people together and have that North Star kind of vision, in the future, I think it would be awesome if a national level leader went to space into some capacity. I think it would show strong leadership from a national standpoint, and it would inspire people, it would educate people, it would do a lot of things. So thanks for having me on here, sir. And it was very pleased to participate in the panel. If I can ever be of assistance to anybody, I'm available. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Mulder. Appreciate that. And I know you're on LinkedIn, so if folks want to get a hold of you, just go on LinkedIn and look up Chris Mulder. Also, you can go to the atlantacouncil.org website, and you'll find him there as well as a report that he co-authored. So please go out there and take a look at that. General Buck, any closing comments from you, sir?
No, just I'm humbled and honored to be here with such an esteemed panel. I do have an obligation at the bottom of the hour here, so I'm going to have to drop. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, I guess I can share my email. I don't know how we do that yet. But
sir, I'll make sure that
Space
folks
Force
get
Association.
Yes, sir. Reach out to support@ussfa.org, and we'll make sure you get in contact with General Buck.
Cool. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And General Cartwright, over to you, sir, for final comments.
One, thank you for this opportunity. The conversation has been really good and really focused on Space Force, which I think has really been important. I'm going to go back to the Q&A thing, and I see Ben Huff out of SAF 8 SP asking about AI and where that might fit and how it might look. And I just would say, don't pour any cement too quickly. The idea of what AI can do and what it can't do is right now a lot of science fiction and not as much science as we would want it to be. But I do think that he's on the right track of thinking about things like self-defense and standing ROE being areas where AI can operate in a very, very unchallenged way. And space is going to be the place where we try that stuff out first, because we have to. So I think that's going to be important. And then the last piece here again is the intent here of the study was not to supplant the national security strategy, but to enhance it and to look beyond and look out into the future and say, where are we going and why? And to give both commerce and government some idea of the intent and to keep that discussion going. And thank you for keeping this discussion going. This has been very good platform for this kind of issue.
Thank you, General Cartwright and Lieutenant Colonel Mulder, both for taking time out of your busy schedules to have this discussion with us. The Space Force Association is here to support, educate, advocate for a strong U.S. Space Force and to ensure the Guardians have what they need to accomplish their mission. So if you want to find out more information about the Space Force, please go to ussfa.org, or to find out more about the study and to read the study, please go to the atlantacouncil.org website. And thanks everyone for being here today. And this will be recorded and we'll publish this later on the website. So thanks again for your time. We look forward to future discussions. As you say, we need to continue the dialogue, and that's what we'll continue to do. So we look forward to future discussions in the future. And thanks again for your time, and have a great day.